My name is Garrison Simpson, and I'll be talking to you about Rav versus St. Paul today. Really, when it comes down to it, the reason I chose Rav versus St. Paul was based upon the action that was took, and that was the cross that was burned in the yard of a young African American family by a juvenile white person. And I felt like that was very interesting just based upon myself being a minority, and then also reading different cases that had to pertain to race and discrimination as such. When also looking at Rav versus St. Paul, I like that it dealt with the First Amendment based upon freedom of speech, being in the being in communications, E&B, electronic media and broadcast. Speech is everything. It really is what we all work under. And so when I was looking at cases that I thought that impacted really what was going on and the expression of ideas, I thought that Rav versus St. Paul, or Rav versus the city of St. Paul, would be a good look as well. And then just the overall view of it, just somebody acting out of hatred and expressing symbols of discrimination and racial bias, presenting that to someone, and then feeling like their ideas, their way of thinking should be protected under freedom of speech based upon things that should be protected under freedom of speech. I feel like it was interesting to look at that, dissect it, and learn more about it. So hopefully from my presentation and my understandings and what my own thinking is, that you all will understand where I'm coming from and what I felt was necessary to describe in this presentation. So thank you, and here we go.
So for background, several teenagers allegedly burned a crudely fashioned cross on a black family's lawn, which I talked about with the Joneses. And the police charged one of the teens under a local bias-motivated criminal ordinance, which prohibited the display of a symbol which arouses anger, alarm, or resentment in others on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender, which is what I was talking about and what the First Amendment actually protects itself. The teenagers took the symbol of the cross, which they planted in the yard, and when they lit that on fire, that was an alarm or resentment of others based upon race. And previously, the city had already established an ordinance about burning things such as crosses or swastikas and displays of these symbols. So that's where the teenager was found guilty under the city ordinance. And then moving on, so when it comes to law review, the trial court dismissed the original charge. And when we look at this, what I found was that the state Supreme Court reversed the decision. And when Rav appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court then interpreted that the First Amendment prevents government from punishing speech and expressive conduct because it disapproves of the ideas expressed. So basically what was argued, or what the young man who was trying to get the appeal argued, was that the city ordinance strictly went against the First Amendment because they felt the city ordinance was put into place based upon it disapproving the ideas that were expressed. So therefore, the young man felt like he was on trial and he was wrongly accused because the city locked down on what he could and could not say. But the city itself made that decision because they themselves disapproved of the racial expression that was the cross burning in the yard. But the young man was arguing that it was his own speech and he shouldn't be punished for the expressive conduct just based upon the city ordinance and the city not agreeing with what he viewed. To me, I felt like this was a clear violation of the amendment, actually. I felt like the young man took what he thought was his expression, placed them on somebody else's property, and then projected himself and his thoughts personally out into the public mind. And when doing so, when he projects these out into the public, that is where he is therefore in a wrongful act, because he is portraying these images of hate. He is portraying these images that he felt were necessary to get his point across. And the people that were affected by those, the victims of the images or the symbols of the burning cross, were not allowed to have their that expression towards them because of what was violated and how it was brought about. It was okay I'm not deeming that this man's thoughts were necessary, like they are verified. I do not agree with this at all. But it is okay for someone to have their own thoughts as such. Now, only when the young man took his personal thoughts and projected them into the public onto that person's lawn, trying to express what he felt was his own freedom of speech, that was where he messed up, and he should not have gone about this. Times I felt like this could be referred to as like intimidation. Like the burning symbol of the cross was there to show the family that they were not welcome, so that hopefully in thoughts that maybe they would not stick around or they would leave the actual area. So when I looked at this and I thought about, okay, the young man said that his symbol was being directly targeted because the city itself did not agree with the expression, rather than his actual symbol itself arousing anger or stepping on somebody's freedom of speech not being applied in the right way. I felt that that was wrong and that the ruling should not have been overturned. I was actually against it. I agree with what it's saying here because when you look at the ordinance, it was put into place specifically to prevent things like this happening. It wasn't because the city wanted to outcast people's amendment. It wasn't because the city wanted to shut down people's right to freedom of speech. They were not trying to have censorship on what people can and cannot believe. However, when you look at it in the U.S. Supreme Court decision, the reason why the U.S. Confederate flag is still accepted in our society is because people feel like it's a position of history. It represents our past and what we've come through. And when I think about that, I think about this case really because, like I said, the image of the cross itself burning is not one that is represented anything that is in a positive manner. And when you look at the Confederate flag, now I for one am also on the left with this decision. I don't not believe, or I believe that the Confederate flag should not always be shown. I do not believe that it should be like in the statues, should be represented outside schools and stuff like that, based upon my own thoughts. And I do understand that freedom of speech and what people feel like should be expressed when it comes to this history. I understand the history argument, understanding where we came from, but I feel like the purpose of this flag was to represent a nation of individuals who were fighting for something that was to oppress another group of individuals. And when I'm a part of the group that was being oppressed, I cannot agree with the showing of this flag, or still the appropriation that is accepted around this flag based upon what I feel it represents and how I feel people really go about that act. The only thing that I feel the court should do is better explain like what constitutes as racial discrimination or biases that are not protected by the First Amendment, because I, for one, would feel like the Confederate flag is a racial discrimination just based upon what it represents and the people that were really in the construct of it and who made up the Confederate flag, just their ideologies, their decisions, how they felt, what they were trying to express, and what their nation meant. Because I feel like people don't look at it as the whole picture. They only look at it, it's history, it happened, it's part of our flags, so we need to remember that. But in actuality, this flag was representing a nation that was trying to hold back and enslave an entire race, and that I do not agree with whatsoever. So I feel like when it comes to freedom of speech, the U.S. Constitution really and the Supreme Court need to look at racial discrimination as a whole and what constitutes or the biases that are not protected by the First Amendment. Just going over that, re-emphasizing what should and should not be expressed based on ideas of hatred, or when it comes to dealing with another race or another gender or another religion. What can people say? What can they get away with? And what is too far in the gray area that is not acceptable to the public? That was really the overview when it comes to Rev versus St. Paul. We see in the past how things were ruled. History does seem to repeat itself, so Like I say, I feel like the Confederate flag is another piece that could really tie in to Rev versus St. Paul, and basically ideas of what images, what symbols, what can we put out there that represents freedom of speech without encroaching on another one or sending the wrong message or making our freedom of speech more about hate rather than expressing our own ideas. So with that being said, I do not agree with the way that Rev versus St. Paul was officially looked at. When it was overturned and the young man got off with what he did, I did not agree with that at all. I felt like what he was displaying, the cross that he had in the yard, and what the acts of the teenagers were, I felt like that was wrongful and that their freedom of speech was not protected by the First Amendment. Thank you for your time.